welcome to the podcast. My name is CJ Gross. I am the founder of Ascension Worldwide, and I'm joined to have this conversation on the impact of minorities as it pertains to economics by Giles Boothway. And Giles is a professor at St. Bonaventure University. He focuses and studies economics and finance. His background or his education is from Brown University and University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Thank you for joining us to have this conversation, Giles. I'm really interested in just, I met you over the summer at Oxford University, and we had a lot of discussion around economics and finance, but I thought this would be interesting to really talk about how does economics impact diverse and minority groups more or differently in respect to non-minority groups. So before we get into that, could you just give us the basic tenets for economics for those who don't know?
Well, economics really is all about the allocation of scarce resources. Resources are not infinite. So because they're scarce, we need to, delimit them properly or make sure they are properly distributed. That's the short answer of economics. Now, the discipline is really split into two parts: microeconomics, which concentrates on individual firms and households, the decisions you and I make on what we're going to buy, the decisions that firms make on what they're going to sell and produce. And then macroeconomics, which really looks at the big picture, the big issues in an economy as a whole. For example, economic growth, balance of trade, and probably more importantly, unemployment and inflation, which of course directly affects individuals. And it affects individuals differently. It's not like the rate of unemployment is flat across races and gender. It varies. So looking into all these issues is very interesting. And we notice recurring patterns, especially when you're looking at things from a race point of view: white, Black, Asian American, and Hispanic Americans. And if you just pick any issue, for example, average FICO score or unemployment or single families, you notice that the same pattern comes up again and again and again. In other words, looking at from best to worst, Asian Americans seem to fare better than whites. Whites fare better than than Hispanic Americans, and Hispanic Americans fare better than African Americans. So the African Americans are at the bottom on almost every important level. So we shouldn't really, when we're picking a fight, how to solve this, we've got to be aware of how these numbers are distributed. And
so Giles, let me back up for 1 second, because I'm sure people are listening to those numbers and going, really? So there is Asian American, white American, and then Hispanic American, and then African American on the bottom, generally speaking, across the different sectors.
Every time.
Oh, every time. Okay.
For example, let's just look at the unemployment rate in the United States in the second quarter of this year, so the most recent quarterly figures. The economy-wide, that's everybody, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. Now that was made up of white, 3.1%, Blacks, 5.9%,
wow.
Asian American, 2.8%, the lowest, and Hispanic American, 4.1%. Now you see that pattern: Asian Americans best, then white, then Hispanic, then Black, in almost any metric that you want to look at. For example, let's look at incarceration rates in the United States. The total incarceration rate is 1.89%. Now, that made up of whites, 0.94%, Black 6.67, Asian American 1.4, and Hispanic 2.8. So you're seeing the same pattern come up again and again and again. Asian American at the top of the pile, then white, then Hispanic, then African Americans. You can look at average FICO score, white 727, Asian Americans 745, better, Hispanic Americans 662, and then at the bottom, African Americans 627.
Wow.
So any metric that you look at, it almost follows from best to worst, Asian American, white, Hispanic, and Black.
What's the reason? From an economic perspective, not necessarily from a social perspective, but from an economic perspective, what if we pull back the veil to the mechanics behind the system? Is there anything from an economic perspective that we can explore that kind of tells how these numbers came to be?
Obviously, the first gut reaction is that this is simply racial discrimination. But of course, there is going to be some form of racial discrimination going on. But, and I'm not going to say how much, I don't know, but there's, I believe, far more going on than just simple racial discrimination going on. If we look at urban areas, when I taught several graduate courses in economics, and I showed my students in my MBA class the unemployment rates, which I have just given you. Now, they go up, they go down, but the pattern is always the same. Okay. Incidentally, female unemployment is always slightly lower than male unemployment. Okay. That's a different issue. And I would ask the class to think about this for a week and try and answer the question, why do you think African American unemployment is much higher than white American? Normally about double. And what I found, and this thing came up almost every time I taught the course, which was interesting, is African American students who were in the MBA program would always mention transportation as an issue. Okay. Because in big cities, public transportation in the United States, if we look at the three top cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Okay. Those cities, well, Los Angeles maybe not, but Chicago and New York have extensive extensive subway systems. Now, that's to what I would call European standard. Like you visited London and you went around on the underground, the buses. Everybody travels like that. People live in London and New York City and might go through life without ever having to get a driver's license because they don't need to.
Right, it's like in New York.
But for most US cities, that's not the case. So, for example, in Buffalo, New York, which is my biggest system, there's no subway, but there is a bus system, but it's not spectacularly good. And therefore, if you are a minority and you rely on public transportation to get you to work, you're limiting yourself to areas where the buses go. And therefore, there are fewer job opportunities available for you. So I think public transportation is probably an issue that I believe deserves a whole lot more attention when it comes to how it affects unemployment. So that, for example, was one thing that came up. The obvious one, again, is education.
What are the numbers on that? I mean, after you get finished, I'm just curious, does that follow the same trend?
It follows exactly the same pattern. For example, if we look at college graduation in 5 years, so people who got their college degree in 5 years, were white 62%, African American 40%, Asian American 70%, Hispanic 42%. Exactly the same pattern as unemployment.
So there's a correlation with education.
FICO score, incarceration rates, this sort of thing. Now, within the reason I bring up incarceration rate is because this might skew the unemployment numbers a little bit, because the rate of unemployment in the United States is not calculated as the number of people who are unemployed divided by, say, the population over the age of 16. It's divided instead by what's called the labor force participation rate. In other words, adults who are ready and willing to work, and they're either willing to work or they have a job. Now, the thing is with the high incarceration rate is if you are incarcerated, you fall out of the labor force. Therefore, you are dividing the number of Black unemployed by a smaller number of labor force African Americans, which is going to artificially inflate the Black unemployment rate. So part of it is a statistical issue, but the pattern remains the same. And an obvious example is education. Now, in my home country of the United Kingdom, all schools, I mean, what we call a middle school, high school, are funded by the central government. In other words, every school, every state school gets the amount of money dealing with their demographics. Surprisingly, in the United States, the school system is not so much funded by the federal government, but by your local municipality, which means that if you live in a nice, Tony neighborhood of Chicago, like Lake Forest, which is the richest suburb of Chicago, way north on the lake, old money, then your municipality has got money to burn on education. Most of the teachers earn six figures, earn more than I do. But if you are in a depressed urban area with a low tax base, then your school, money for the school is going to be significantly less, which means that two children aged 18 of equal intelligence, equal ability, equal work ethic will not get the same education in a public school, because one has great teachers, lots of laboratories, and the others don't. So
and that impacts them going to college.
It impacts them going to college.
It impacts them to get the level of education, or even get an education, or getting the level of education they need, which then correlates with the income, which then correlates with all of the other.
Exactly. It seems trite to say, but having more money opens far more doors than having less money. For example, a couple of days ago, I have savings account because I'm a big saver. I can save because I earn good money. So I have savings. Now, with all this inflation that we've seen recently, one of the good things is that savers can now invest their money at a higher rate of interest, because inflation and interest rates are correlated. So because I've been able to save, because I'm well off, because I'm educated, I can now take advantage of putting my money in a one-year CD at 4.5%. Well, if you don't have any money to start with, you can't take advantage of this. Therefore, the inflation is hurting you twice as bad. You're spending more on food, and you can't get a decent rate of return on the money you do.
And the gas is higher. So if you're in those areas, if you have a car, it's more expensive for you to travel. And then if you're relying on public transportation, it may be more expensive, which means you may have challenges getting to work and all those things. Now, I have a question for you now. Is there, how does all this play into the middle class? Is it the same numbers across the different races in terms of like middle class? So someone with a 4-year education that lives in a house, that does have a car, do we see those trends in the same way?
Exactly the same
Really?
order that we see everywhere else. It doesn't matter where you look, you see the same pattern.
Wow.
I don't want to use best to worst because that's not what I mean, but loosely speaking, for illustration, Asian Americans better off than whites, then Hispanics, and then unfortunately at the bottom, African Americans. And it doesn't matter if they're working class, lower middle class, or upper class, the same pattern comes up again and again. If you look at for example, single families which have only a single mother or a single father, the pattern is exactly the same way.
Wow.
35% white, 65% black, 55% Asian, and 38% Hispanic. Exactly the same pattern. Almost pick any issue that you want to choose, and you will see the same pattern across across different incomes.
Wow. Okay.
So very, very, very similar. I think it's very dangerous to try and look at things in too much isolation. It's like a mosaic. You're seeing patterns. The picture is broad but made up of different things. So you can't, for example, say, well, we're going to spend all our time and energy to try and level out FICO scores across races. No, because the FICO scores feed into the unemployment rate, feed into the single parent rate, feed into the incarceration rate. So it's all related. You've got to look at it in the big picture and try and pick one or two issues where you think it will alleviate this problem. For example, I don't know for sure, but I imagine that minorities are greater users of public transportation than non-minorities, because minorities have the ability to drive to work and therefore can have a greater area where they can go for jobs. So, for example, if public transportation were improved, it would work in favor of minorities. It won't really affect Asian Americans and white Americans that much. It means that African Americans, if they're better public transportation, have got a greater catchment area for where they work. Instead of looking at one little area in the city, now they can look at 3 or 4 areas of the city and pick the job that best suits them.
I have a question. So are there outliers? And I don't know if when you look at, being a statistician, if you consider outliers, right? Is that something you're like, those are outliers, we don't pay attention to outliers? But I'm curious, if you do, are there any themes with the outliers? So if you have someone who is a person of color or Hispanic, and those numbers are totally different and off, is there any theme in those outliers? Like, for example, did they go to, Ivy League schools, education? Did they go to, Harvard or, Brown University, or, what, if there are any patterns, what are those patterns for the outliers?
Yes, of course, there are outliers everywhere. There are extremely successful African Americans, and there always have been. You can go back to Berry Gordy, for example, or people in the entertainment industries. The old mayor of New Orleans, who unfortunately got himself in a little bit of trouble before he was mayor of New Orleans, was an extremely high executive in the telecommunications industry. So there are outliers, successful Hispanic Americans, successful African Americans, and there are white people who are bums. Who just are outliers at the bottom. There must be outliers in the Asian American community as well. Successful, very, very, very successful people have a certain something, a sort of entrepreneurial spirit or a drive or a work ethic that I don't think is race specific. I think you find those in white people, in Asians, in Hispanics. For example, I'm not a particularly entrepreneurial person, but I know Black people who are, and I know Hispanics who are. So I don't think that really follows the pattern, the outliers, because it's driven by, I think, individual qualities.
Got it. So if we were to think about like solving some of these challenges, and I say we, I'm talking about as a society, not necessarily just individuals or businesses, but as a society, you've already given us one thing to focus on, is to look at the not the systemic, the systemic problem, and not the what's causing the symptom. Or the symptom, not looking at the symptom, but looking at the actual problem. So you mentioned transportation. Is there any other, like, one or two things?
Again, I think transportation is one that I personally have come across in my teaching, just talking to, for example, African-American people in Buffalo, and they complain that the bus service where it is good, but it doesn't go to a lot of areas. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that really, if anything, it's education. We have got to find in the United States a way of funding schools in a more equitable way, and not relying on the local municipality. Now, of course, all the municipalities get help from the federal government, but a lot of the funding comes from the municipality. If you live in a poor municipality, you're going to have a poor school. Right. And therefore, the unfortunate minorities in that school district won't have a decent chemistry lab. The teachers won't be paid well. Therefore, the good teachers who know their value will go to schools that will pay them more. So,
and it's harder to get into that community, the nicer communities, even if you make money, if you don't have a good FICO score.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's a reciprocal thing that is perpetuated through each component, whether it's education, income, whether it's FICO score. All of those are kind of like a loop that support one another.
Absolutely. And what I noticed when I was at Brown, where I did my graduate work, was that I would come across African-American and Hispanic students who were of undoubted high intelligence, but they struggled in their first year or two because they didn't have the schooling that other people in richer municipalities had. So some of them, unfortunately, despite being well capable of graduating from those universities, dropped out because they arrived at the university behind the other students because of their poor high school. Nothing to do with intelligence or work ethic or anything like that. They weren't prepared properly.
So that's education. How does this trickle down into the workplace? Like all of these components of economics and transportation, education. How does that impact, because in my work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, HR professionals are always trying to figure out how to find more minorities, not at the entry level and not even at the mid-management level, but at the C-suite level. How does that, what we've been talking about so far, apply to the workplace?
I've heard very often recently employers say, we have a job, but we cannot find the right candidates.
Right, to
fill it. Mm-hmm. And this is a problem I've heard a lot of. But this goes back to education. And if we have a better educated group or cohort of students, then employers will have a greater selection, and it's far more likely to find the people that they're looking for. Another thing that I think is important, and this was this was something we noticed after the 2008 recession. Now, this doesn't so much have a racial component or a race component, but what was noticed is that the main feature of the 2008 recession was obviously a lot of people lost their jobs, but house prices fell. The median, the middle house price before 2008 was, I believe, $355,000. And that fell within a year to $275,000. So that was a pretty chunky $60,000 decline in median house prices. Now, what happened there was that a lot of people who'd taken out mortgages were suddenly underwater.
Yep.
Now,
Remember,
the problem there is that it will create a mismatch between jobs and job applicants. For example, let's suppose in 2009 you found that you were underwater on your mortgage by $40,000. In other words, if you had to sell your house, you had to write a check for $40,000 out of your own money. Now, suddenly, let's suppose you're living in Philadelphia, and suddenly the job that fits you the best, your ideal job, the job of a lifetime, comes up in, for example, San Diego, California. You can't take it.
right?
You can't take it. So there was a mismatch caused by this. It was an income effect. Now, if we know that minorities have, let's suppose to coin a word, income challenged, then they too will find that they're in a mismatch. They can't necessarily get to the ideal job for them because they can't afford to. They can't afford to move. They can't afford this. They can't afford that. So more minorities find themselves in jobs that they don't particularly care for, that doesn't really interest them. And therefore, it wouldn't be surprising if, you know, their effort wasn't as high as it would be in a job that they liked. Therefore, it makes the income effect even worse.
So, one, I just want to thank you, Giles, for taking the time to have this conversation. I think when the viewers listen to this, it gives them another lens to think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how it impacts minorities in different ways when you're not in that group, or even when you're in that group, you may not know. And I think in my recent book, What's Your Zip Code Story? Understanding and Overcoming Class Bias, it kind of talks a little bit about those things that you mentioned, but also the social capital aspect, like, so the mentorship to get out of that, right? So the, you know, scholarships and all those other components that help minorities or in all class migrants move up through the economics and career in their career journey. So I think it's important to really consider this at the level of a government, at the level of a community, at the level of a large corporation, and I'm hoping that our viewers kind of take that away. So thank you again so much for taking the time, Giles Boothway.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Professor at St. Bonaventure University, my alma mater. So I look forward to having other conversations with you.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.